What an outrageous statement. China and India's living standards are behind the West because of the East India Company. Do I need to remind this guy what's happened in China in the last 100 years? Welcome back to History Revealed. Now, today I'm going to be reacting to the video about the rise of the East India Company by Kings and Generals. Kings and Generals is an amazing military history account, and they normally make incredible stuff. But I have seen them stray from the path a bit lately. And lots of you, and I mean lots, requested that I make a video in reaction to this one. It clearly ruffled a few feathers. So let's see what we've got in store.
Imagine, if you will, an evil corporation controlling the lives of hundreds of millions of people. A dystopian conglomerate that possesses a private army 3 times the size of the armed forces of its home country.
Okay, we're off to a very, very bad start. An evil corporation and a dystopia that they've created. Now, Kings and Generals have covered historical figures like Timur, Tamerlane, and Genghis Khan. I don't remember them ever describing them as evil or creating a dystopian reality. You know, the Mongol hordes creating a dystopia across Asia and Europe. But for the East India Company, historical objectivity is out the window and we're going straight for evil. Very bad start.
Lobbying and bribing politicians with impunity to further its endless world-eating hunger.
Again, what a description. World-eating hunger. They cover some of the greatest conquerors in history, you know, Alexander, Julius Caesar. I've never heard them describe those men in such pejorative terms, but the East India Company seems uniquely evil for wanting conquest, for wanting acquisition of territory and resources. Very, very disappointing way of describing things.
No, we're not talking about Arasaka Corporation from Cyberpunk, or even the ExxonMobils or Samsungs of the modern-day real world. Instead, we're talking about a private corporation that was founded when wooden sailing ships still plied across the oceans. One of the world's first joint stock companies, which began as a band of pirates and scoundrels during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and evolved before the time of Queen Victoria into an international megacorporation responsible for the ruination and impoverishment of the largest and richest continent in the world.
What the hell is that? That is an opinion. That is I would say, a fairly extreme opinion. Now, there are people who believe that. So, for example, the very commonly sort of told myth is that Britain stole $45 trillion from India. Now, you hear it was a Marxist historian who came up with that. Shocker. And people repeat this sort of thing all the time. Now, I appreciate they haven't said that, but the whole idea of sort of Britain impoverishing India is not clear-cut, and it's certainly not a settled debate. So, for example, a man who I think is one of the best historians on India is an economic historian named Tirthankar Roy, and he explains that there is actually a lot of nuance in the economic change that Britain brought about in India. So the East India Company caused the entire Indian economy to shift. Now, in many ways, that was for the better, and in many ways, that was for the worse. Britain sort of caused modernization in India as Britain was industrializing and Europe was industrializing, whilst Asia, Africa, Oceania wasn't. And that change had profound consequences. And it's a very varied picture. The East India Company most certainly ruled India in their own economic interest, as did every conqueror of India. And instead of describing that nuance, and by the way, it's an interesting historical debate, sort of what the economic effect of British colonialism was on India. But no, they've drawn a line in the sand and said, this is how it is. Britain impoverished India and the continent. Very poor.
Before we dive into the humble origins of the British East India Company, let us first take a broader look at its pernicious legacy of corporate violence.
dear. The historical objectivity isn't just out the window, it's on the road and it's at the border.
It is common knowledge that throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the British conquered India and humiliated China.
Skill issue.
However, it was not the British government that did these things, but a dangerously unregulated private company, the most destructive megacorporation in human history.
Oh my god, come on. The most destructive mega corporation in human history. It's like, can you just get a hammer and sickle out? This is awful. Like, from a channel that I've loved for so long, that's been so informative, to describe things in such an emotive and downright childish way is...
The British East India Company was not an extension of the British Army, the Royal Navy, or any branch of the civilian government. It was an independent, for-profit organisation which minted its own coins, passed its own laws, and prosecuted wars against foreign powers with a private army, which was one of the largest militaries in the world.
Now, this is what you have to remember about the British Empire and the East India Company. Their greatest skill was their ability to collaborate with the locals. The majority of the troops in their armies were Indian, and this was the case at all the key stages of the conquest. So whether it was the Battle of Plassey, when Robert Clive took the East India Company from a trading power to a territorial power, or whether it was the Battle of Assaye, when the Duke of Wellington was deep in the heart of enemy territory, outnumbered, and won a stunning victory to secure Britain's hold in India, or whether it was the greatest challenge to company rule, which was the mutiny in 1857. The majority of the soldiers fighting the Indian rebels were Indians loyal to the British. This was the entire method of the conquest. Without this cooperation, none of it would have been possible. Britain just didn't have the manpower to do it alone. So without the great ability to build alliances and inspire loyalty, there is no way that the entire Indian subcontinent could have been captured and then held. Totally impossible.
The East India Company was an empire within an empire,
That's the perfect description of the company.
simultaneously entwined with Britain's imperial history, while also colonizing vast swaths of Asia as its own private entity. Unlike India's previous conquerors, who had a stake in the governance of the land, the British East India Company's only purpose was to enrich its shareholders, which it did by siphoning the wealth of India and transferring it westward to enrich.
Okay. That's, again, a very cynical way of looking at things. Like, when the Mughals conquered, they did, yeah, sure, they had a stake in governing it for their own interest, for their own wealth. That's why they conquered. They didn't do it out of, oh, well, we want to help the Indians. We're going to leave Central Asia and take over India so we can help out those Indians. Yeah, empires do what empires do. And even by King's and General's standard, the East India Company had a stake in how India was governed, because if it wasn't governed properly, firstly, they wouldn't make profit, and secondly, they'd face constant rebellion, and which would affect their profits. So it's wrong to say they didn't have a stake in how it was governed. And by the way, if the East India Company officials had talked about, let's say, the benefits they could bring to the Indians, maybe civilizing them in one way or another, that would only be treated as cynical. Only ever treated as cynical. So even if they made some effort to improve their lives, it would be seen in only a negative light.
Handful of oligarchs living on a rainy island 7,500 kilometers away. It was no coincidence that Bengal, one of the most fertile regions in the world, suffered an apocalyptic famine, which claimed over 10 million lives under company rule.
They're doing it again. So just stating highly disputed claims as fact. So the man I mentioned earlier, Tirthankar Roy, he completely contradicts what they have just said. So he claims that the famine was not the fault of the company, but a result of natural disasters. The variable monsoons led to a drought, and that was the cause of the famine. And the company's ability to actually respond to that was incredibly limited. And it's also worth noting that at this point in time, whilst the East India Company were collecting the taxes in Bengal, the local administration was still being done by the Nawab, so the local lord. So there's a complex picture, whatever way you look at it. And I personally think Roy's argument about the variable monsoons is much more convincing than the people who condemn the East India Company. But clearly, nuance and debate, as we have clearly seen, is not something that Kings and Generals is interested in.
Beyond the Indian subcontinent, the self-styled Honourable Company was also responsible for being the harbinger of China's infamous century of humiliation, breaking down the closed doors of the Celestial Empire with a flood of addictive drugs whose sickly smoke flower embrace indiscriminately transformed everyone from the lowliest...
God, the flowery descriptions are just cringe. Yeah, anyone who uses the century of humiliation as like a descriptive term of what happened to China, rather than saying something like the term century of humiliation is used by Chinese people to describe what happened, they're doing activism. The main people who use this term, by the way, tend to be the Chinese Communist Party. They love the idea that China was this wonderful civilized place that then was ruined by the Europeans and the Japanese as well. I find it funny how sort of suddenly we have sympathy for empires. So the Qing Empire, huge empire, was attained and maintained with brutality. Suddenly we should feel sorry that Britain came along and humiliated them. Now, it's worth noting that part of the reason they were humiliated by Britain is because of their own arrogance in the first place. They treated British officials who greeted them and tried to negotiate with them as foreign barbarians. And so when the Opium Wars happened, which I'm sure they'll discuss, it never occurred to them that these foreign barbarians could defeat the greatest civilization on Earth. But, they were humbled.
From the lowliest Zhuangzhou peasant to the highest Manchu noble, into sunken-eyed, emaciated zombies wasting
we're still
away
doing
in their
this.
beds. Historically, India and China were by far the richest and most culturally influential regions on Earth. Yet, in modern times, they are still fighting to catch up to the West in technology, wages, standard of living, and global cultural influence. This is the modern legacy of a single private company.
What an outrageous statement. China and India's living standards are behind the West because of the East India Company. Do I need to remind this guy what's happened in China in the last 100 years? Is he aware that the Japanese invaded them and that they lost more civilians in the Second World War than any other country, and that the whole nation was devastated by the Japanese invasion? Do you think that might have set them back a bit? Or if that wasn't enough, the fact that what followed them was the communists taking over and Chairman Mao, history's greatest mass murderer, leading the country to disaster, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward. He executed the country's intellectuals, millions of them, the landlords, any competent people. He got rid of them and starved tens of millions of people. Absolute ravaged the country. And they think it's the East India Company that's caused this legacy, the legacy of lower living standards and lesser cultural significance. Oh, and when it comes to India, did the East India Company force them to run a socialist economy for their first years after independence? And is the East India Company for the massive corruption when Indians take bribes from other Indians? Absolutely pathetic. Well, I'm in a bad mood now. They went from distorting history and selectively applying things to outright fantasy and wish casting, claiming that the lower living standards and cultural significance of China and India is a result of the legacy of the East India Company, and providing no evidence for this whatsoever. Like I said, that modern China, modern India, that these decisions are somehow a colonial legacy. It's incredibly damaging, this stuff, because people make these arguments all the time about post-colonial countries. And it just gives the corrupt officials and politicians in these countries a get-out-of-jail-free card, because the history can't change, and they can always just blame the legacy of colonialism. And that will satisfy many Western critics of theirs as a good enough reason for their corruption and for their mismanagement and their general incompetence. And it's the it's the gift that keeps on giving. The history will never change. The colonial legacy will always be there. And how do we move forward when people use these excuses and people buy these excuses? It's sad. It's sad seeing this happen to kings and generals. It's like seeing a friend of yours who you knew wants to be a great, sort of good-looking guy, great job, confident man, and now you see he's a homeless alcoholic, like sat at the side of the road. Like, how the mighty have fallen. I never thought I would hear this sort of thing from a kings and generals videos. I'm seriously disappointed, and I hope you are too.
During the 1500s, the Kingdom of England was a far cry from the global juggernaut it would later become. A poor nation with a meagre population of 4 million, it had no colonial holdings besides...
Just listen to the language there. I think this is the theme throughout. It's just this very negative portrayal of anything, well, British or European, a poor nation with a meager population. I can't imagine he would ever talk about, let's say, one of the Indian kingdoms like that, even if it was poor and even if its population was meager.
Wales and Ireland, and was a century removed from the Act of Union with Scotland, which would create the Kingdom of Great Britain. Ever since becoming a Protestant kingdom during the reign of Henry VIII, it had suffered deteriorating relations with the recently unified Catholic monarchies of Portugal and Spain.
Right, given I'm already angry with them, I'm going to correct them a little there. England didn't exactly become Protestant during Henry VIII's reign. Henry VIII, despite the break with the Pope, and despite founding the Church of England, was never a Protestant. He was not England's first Protestant king. That was his son.
Consequently, the English sought to get in on the spice trade, and colonization hitherto monopolized by their Catholic rivals. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, English adventurers began roving out into the endless sapphire expanse in search of Spanish treasures. English privateers like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Sir James Lancaster were the most successful at this, sailing far across the world as they pillaged Spanish holdings in the New World and made contact with the rulers of the Spice Islands, returning to England with cargoes richly fraught with gold, silver, pearls, and precious spices.
So this is a very important aspect of Elizabeth I's reign, which is often overlooked because of the Spanish Armada, which was a much more pressing matter at the time and is a much more studied subject in history. But Elizabeth encouraging this sort of exploration and the activities against the Spanish would have a large impact later on, sort of laying the foundations for the British Empire and the East India Company, which I'm sure they'll mention.
These journeys whet the English public's appetite for commercial expansion into the oceanic domains of their Spanish and Portuguese rivals, something which became more possible after England decimated the mighty Spanish Armada in 1588. However, the English monarchy was still a poor one, and did not have the treasury to regularly fund long-range expeditions across the open ocean. This was, after all, a pre-industrial era, where the vast majority of nations did not even have the finances to maintain formal standing armies.
That is true, and it's an interesting aspect of sort of pre-modern society. We just assume every country has an army, but of course, prior to modern times, countries raised armies for specific reasons. They didn't have a standing army. I believe the first standing army in Great Britain was the New Model Army during the Civil War. I think it's from that point onwards that England and Britain had a standing army, although you might correct me in the comments.
Sailing across the world in the 16th century was an astronomically expensive venture, requiring the construction of the largest and most costly ships of the time. Moreover, the risks of these expeditions were enormous and manifold, with perils like disease, hostile weather, hostile natives, and Spanish and Portuguese patrols contributing to a high fatality rate for its sailors. Thus, the English government bankrolled its colonial dreams using a method intimately familiar to those who live in our modern corporate landscape, by shunting the costs onto private corporations known as joint stock companies. The idea of the joint stock company was one of Tudor England's most groundbreaking economic innovations. Its origins lay in the craft guilds of medieval Europe, in which merchants or artisans from a specific profession could pool their resources to undertake ventures none could afford to make individually. Joint stock companies were a natural expansion of this idea, allowing anyone to invest in a venture without even being directly involved in it. The idea of being able to make money by simply buying shares and waiting for them to increase in value is not only normal in our modern day, but the cornerstone of the global economy.
So this is very important. And the early growth of the British Empire was effectively an early version of outsourcing. This wasn't the armies of the English state going forth and conquering the way it was with the Spanish. This was different in that you had private individuals with state approval. Private enterprises were going out to find the trade routes, to form relationships, and to bring back these highly sought after goods. Now, the goal at first wasn't really conquest. That came later. You wanted sort of maybe a little bit of territory, maybe a port you controlled, or a small enclave, but nothing particularly. And as he points out, the innovation of the joint stock company is hugely significant because it allows people to pool their resources and fund this extremely expensive endeavor. And it's weird to think sort of something as simple as, the joint stock company, simple to us, was, as was said, a real innovation of the time and something that changed the world significantly.
However, in the 16th century, it was a brand new innovation.
Yep.
One which titillated many among London's wealthy merchant classes. Consequently, various English trading companies accumulated enough capital to purchase ships and crews for long-range expeditions. These companies were provided with royal charters by the English crown, which granted them monopolies over English trade with certain regions of the world. It was during this era, when the rise of the joint stock company coincided with an English desire to tap into the luxury markets of the East, that a company known as the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies was formed. This name would later be truncated into the far less mouthy East India Company. On the New Year's Eve of 1600, the last day of the first year of the 17th century, the East India Company received its royal charter from the English crown and was given a monopoly over all English trade between the Cape of Good Hope and the Strait of Magellan. Its first governor was the prominent merchant Thomas Smythe, and its other founding members consisted of some of England's most infamous scallywags, such as the pirate Sir James Lancaster and the gentleman adventurer Sir Ralph Fitch. Together they assembled a fleet consisting of 4 ships. Commanded by Sir James Lancaster, the first voyage of the East India Company rounded the Cape of Good Hope and arrived in the Malay archipelago in spring of 1602, forging trade deals with the Sultanates of Aceh and Bantam, and seizing a Portuguese galleon in the region.
So this is a very important thing to remember, very important about the East India Company. The name East India refers to not the east of the Indian subcontinent, but to the East Indies. So as you can see on the map, I'll show you with my mouse, sort of the Spice Islands here, not the east of India up here. Obviously, it came to dominate the continent, the Indian subcontinent, but not the East Indies, which the Dutch would come to dominate. And it's a very interesting sort of story of how a company founded for a specific reason ends up sort of changing course. Like any good company, they pivot and they diversify, and that's how they end up in India rather than the East Indies. However, it's in the name. That was the original goal.
More voyages soon followed, each of which provided cornucopious returns on investment for the company's shareholders. Initially, the company focused its commercial efforts on the Malay archipelago, the islands which make up modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia, as they were where incredibly valuable spices such as nutmegs and cloves were produced.
So, very important to remember, spices, this was real gold dust to Europeans at the time. Now, the spices were so valuable for a few reasons. Firstly, they were a luxury good and they were an essential good. So they were a luxury in that, the way they seasoned food, it was extremely valuable, as well as they could be used for food preservation. And this is in the pre-refrigerator era, where food preservation was done with things like spices. So they were incredibly important. The other thing was they don't weigh very much, and you've got a large profit margin relative to the weight of the product. Whereas something like gold or silver, which is incredibly heavy, is obviously a lot more cumbersome to transport, as is something like fabrics, silks, because whilst they don't weigh very much, they're very bulky. Whereas spices are neither of those things. They weigh very little and they don't take up much space. So transporting them is much more straightforward, and you only have to sell a small amount of the product to earn very large profits. And of course, like any product, people will fight over them, not just for their commercial value, but holding the territory or controlling the shipping lanes where they travel gives you political power. And that's why you had immense competition, both of the native kingdoms and the European powers, for control of the spice territories and the spice routes.
In a surprising plot twist, the Englishmen's main rivals in this region were not the Spanish or Portuguese in the area, but the Dutch. Back home, the Kingdom of England and the Dutch republics were Protestant allies against the Catholics. However, it was a different story in the Far East, where the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was intent on establishing a full monopoly on the production of nutmeg, cloves, and pepper, and were none too happy to see the English honing in on their market.
I'm really pleased he brought up the Dutch East India Company. People don't realise this. The Dutch East India Company was the largest corporation ever. It was worth trillions in modern currency. It's bigger than anything you can think of. It was bigger than Apple, bigger than Amazon, bigger than Standard Oil back in the day. Incredible. But it's not obviously it's known about in the Netherlands, but it's not widely known about the significance of the Dutch East India Company in sort of the Anglosphere, shall we say.
Head to head, the English East India Company was the heavy underdog compared to its Dutch counterpart.
Yes, heavy
possessing
underdog.
Only 1/10 of the financial capital and less than half the ships, crew, and firepower.
Yep.
The English set up in the region regardless, building trading posts on the islands of
See, if he was fair, which he isn't, he might introduce it by saying, isn't it incredible that a small player was to overcome a behemoth like the Dutch East India Company? But obviously he's not going to do that.
Ambon, Java, and on the nutmeg-growing island of Run in 1603. Another island nation that the English East India Company probed into during its early years was the land of the rising sun. The first English vessel to arrive upon Japanese shores was captained by company employee John Saris, who crested upon the southern port of Hirado in January of 1613. There, they were surprised to encounter one of their own countrymen, the famed English samurai, William Adams, who had arrived in
Story of William Adams is a fascinating one, as he says the Englishman who became a samurai and could be the subject of a separate video.
Japan on a Dutch vessel 13 years earlier, and since became a valued vassal to the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu. Adams was instrumental in facilitating an official meeting between Saris and the shogun. Incidentally, Saris's career with the company ended shortly after this trip, after he was discovered with a large collection of Japanese erotica.
Some things never change.
Although the English East India Company established a factory in Hirado, it was short-lived and unsuccessful, unable to compete commercially with their Dutch counterparts, who were better established in the region. After consistently failing to turn a profit, the English factory in Japan was abandoned in 1623.
So, this was done at an interesting point in Japanese history, because after this point, Japan went into isolation. They cut off pretty much all trade with foreign nations, and until the 1850s had very little contact with the outside world, by which point modernity was upon them in the form of American gunships.
Meanwhile, tensions between the English and the Dutch in the Spice Islands were heating up. In the same year the English company left Japan, its factory on the Indonesian island of Ambon was seized by the VOC. By the second half of the 17th century, the Dutch had conquered most of Spain and Portugal's territories in the East Indies and turned their full focus on dislodging the English from the islands. In 1663, the Treaty of Breda saw the English crown compel the East India Company to relinquish their claim on Roon Island and its sweet, sweet nutmeg to the Dutch. England's consolation prize was a little-known island known as Manhattan, a place which would surely never amount to anything.
Again, another one of those small facts, not well known. That's one of the most famous islands in the world, obviously integral part of New York City, but came into sort of British hands and setting the foundation for what would be American hands because of conflict between the Dutch and the British in the Spice Islands of the East Indies.
Pushed out of the Malay archipelago, the English East India Company had little choice but to leave the lucrative Spice Islands behind and focus on another market with equal potential, the ancient civilizations of India. Back in the summer of 1608, the galleon Hector made sight upon the port of Surat, the first English East India Company ship to arrive upon Indian shores. Here, the Englishman's main European competitors were the Portuguese, who had spent the last century developing a network of outposts along the Indian coast, the largest of which being Goa.
Goa, interestingly, was the final part of India to cease to be in the hands of Europeans. India invaded it after the Second World War. Even after Indian independence, Goa remained in Portuguese hands. And yes, controversial action by the Indian government at the time to invade, but yeah, that's what happened.
When the Portuguese first forced their way into India, the land had been divided between many small sultanates and Hindu polities. However, by the time the English arrived, vast swaths of the northern subcontinent had been unified under a new superpower, the Mughal Empire. It cannot be understated what a global titan the Mughal Empire was.
Wait a minute, we're not going to mention the conquest? We're not going to mention what the Mughals did to unite India? I thought we were being cynical. Bear in mind, we're calling the East India Company evil. Are we not going to call Babur evil when he came out of Central Asia with his army and slaughtered his way across India? This was the man who used to make towers of skulls with his enemies. He called them infidels and did this. He created an empire with a sword, and it was expanded by the sword. No, nothing more, nothing less. But the Mughal Empire, they're titans, and the evil East India Company had to deal with them. We should set ourselves a challenge in this video from this point onwards. Now they've mentioned the Mughal Empire, which has got no shortage of sins, by the way. Are they going to mention any of them? Mention them in passing? Are they going to criticize any of the emperors, any of the generals or officials in any way? Because we've just had a diatribe against the East India Company and sort of British and English history. So will this be brought up at all?
Ruling over 1/5 of the world population, it possessed an economy larger than all of Europe's combined and was rivaled
I think we can already see our answer.
Only by Imperial China. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Mughal court in Delhi was a lion, the Portuguese viceroy in Goa was a bobcat, and the English traders who freshly arrived upon Indian shores were mice. So,
okay, imagine if they were making a video about how the British arrived in a certain part of Africa in the late 19th century. Let's say it's equivalent to modern day Zimbabwe, and a British official went to see an African chief to discuss matters. And they described the British Empire as a lion meeting a mouse. They wouldn't dare do that. It would be immediately understood what it meant by that. By the way, even if it was true, this comparison of the lion, the bobcat, and the mouse is not necessarily wrong. It's probably correct. But you know what they're doing when they make this comparison. You know exactly what they're doing.
In order to avoid being eaten by the bobcat, the mice sought the protection of the lion. To that end, 2 English missions were sent to the Mughal capital, one in 1608 and one in 1615. These missions were ultimately a success, resulting in the East India Company being given permission to build a trading outpost in Surat in 1618, the first significant English outpost in the Indian subcontinent. From this toehold, the East India Company purchased further territorial enclaves across the continent, buying the Tamil settlement of Madras from the declining South Indian Vijayanagara Empire in...
Yeah, very, very important to note that the empire was established at its very, very beginning in India with the permission of the rulers. This wasn't an invasion, it was an negotiated economic agreement that was mutually beneficial to both sides.
1639. The East India Company's directors and diplomats assimilated themselves well into the complex politics of the Mughal court, outmaneuvering their European rivals to receive preferential treatment from its all-powerful emperor. As a result, the English commercial presence in India had soon overtaken the Portuguese. In 1661...
Yep, and as I mentioned earlier, it was this ability, I think as much, if not more, than the later ability to project force, that was the secret to the East India Company's success. Their ability to play the political game of India. It's often completely overlooked. By the way, Robert Clive was the absolute master of this, far more than his ability as a general, which was excellent. But he was a political player, and a highly skillful one at that.
The English East Company received the Portuguese outpost of Bombay as part of the dowry King Charles II obtained through his marriage to the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza.
Yeah, another great fact, similar to the Manhattan one. How many people know that when Charles II, who's remembered, of course, for restoring the monarchy after Oliver Cromwell, how many people know that his marriage to Queen Catherine resulted in Britain obtaining, well, England at that time, obtaining Bombay as part of the dowry? Most people remember Queen Catherine, if they remember her at all, for the fact she was Catholic and that she was unpopular for that reason, not realizing that along with her came Bombay.
Bombay quickly grew into the East India Company's largest commercial centre in India, with a booming colonial population of 60,000. As the East India Company expanded its commercial operations in India, it soon became ignominiously involved in the African slave trade, purchasing slaves from East Africa and transporting them to work in their factories in India. This was but the beginning of the exploitation and human misery that the company would become synonymous with in later centuries.
Oh, really? Okay. Haven't mentioned the slave trade under the Mughals or the other Indian kingdoms, which had been going on for centuries, millennia even, but decide to moralize about the slave trade when it was the East India Company who participated in it. Now, yes, they did participate in it, as did every major power of the day, because slavery was an accepted moral standard of this time. The only people who decided it wasn't morally acceptable were the British and Westerners in general, who were the ones who would eventually abolish it. That's a whole side topic, but you can see the direction he's trying to take you in with this stuff.
By the end of the 1600s, the East India Company was by far the most influential private company in English society, with the cottons, silks, tea, coffee, and indigo they imported taking their home country by storm, fundamentally reshaping English consumer culture and kicking off the English tea craze, which remains a core pillar of domestic English culture to this day.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I mean, how many people, when they put the tea bag in the mug every day, realize that this started with the East India Company? This started with a corporation that became an empire. Just it's the simple things that we do in everyday life often have enormous historical significance, and the British love of tea is one of those things.
However, back in India, the East India Company was still very much a supplicant, fully dependent on the goodwill and patronage of the Mughal emperor, to whom they paid obeisance and taxes to. The East India Company found this out the hard way in 1686, when company director Hosea Child declared war on the Mughal realm over a tax hike. The lion mauled the mouse with ease, batting away the English invasion force as easily as if it were swatting flies, and effortlessly seizing every English factory adjacent to Mughal territory.
I'm waiting for kings and generals to make a video about, let's say, the British expedition to Abyssinia in the 1860s, where they describe the British, who were by far the greater power against the Abyssinians, as swatting the Abyssinians like flies. I'd love them to make a video like that. I know they never will, but for consistency's sake, they should.
This humiliating defeat left the company's executives on their literal knees before Emperor Aurangzeb, submitting to Mughal authority and begging him for forgiveness. Feeling clement, Aurangzeb graciously forgave the Englishmen, returned their factories to them, and even allowed them to set up a new one at Calcutta in 1690.
Graciously accepted. Aurangzeb is considered one of the least tolerant Mughal emperors. He was the one who reinstated the jizya tax, which is a special tax for non-Muslims. It had been abolished by Akbar. He reinstated it, and he did all sorts of other things, like his campaigns in the Deccan were particularly brutal, and they describe him as gracious. No, okay, I'm going to treat the Mughals as cynically as they're treating the East India Company. Aurangzeb agreed to let the East India Company back because he was self-interested. It was a self-interested move because he knew that even though they'd fought him, that he made good money off them. It was commercially beneficial to him to maintain a relationship, even despite the trouble. And also, he was dealing with internal problems as well. He wanted to just sort of nip that in the bud and carry on with his reign, dealing with his internal problems. So yeah, that's the cynical answer to why Aurangzeb forgave them. Not painting him in this glorious light. Oh, he was clement and he was gracious.
As dawn rose upon the 1700s, so too did it on the 100-year anniversary of the East India Company. Over the course of a century, the company, founded by a band of pirate adventurers a century earlier, evolved into an extremely successful international enterprise. Although its ventures in Indonesia and Japan had not panned out, its footholds in India were generating fabulous wealth for its shareholders, and it was from these footholds that the company's saga would evolve from a success story to a tale of rapacious infamy. In 1707, the Mughal Empire...
Right, okay. It's about to get worse, isn't it? Rapacious infamy. Still not applied that standard to the Mughals. It could well be applied. It really could, but he hasn't applied that yet.
Empire shattered. The reign of Emperor Aurangzeb had seen the Mughal Empire reach its territorial zenith, but left its vast armies diminished and its treasury depleted. After his death, hereditary vassals across the empire took advantage of the central government's weakness and severed their ties to the imperial capital of Delhi, resulting in the political fragmentation of the subcontinent.
I imagine it will be mentioned, but this is what allowed the East India Company to go from the trading power that they were to the territorial power. Is the division, the Indian division. Obviously, a united India would have been impossible to conquer, but they were able to work with those divisions, and the Indians wanted to work with them. I mean, that's a crucial part of the story, is that the Indians saw them as reliable to provide money and weapons and diplomatic cover, whatever it may be. and willingly worked with them. And they obviously took advantage and would become the rulers of India.
Suddenly, the East India Company was no longer a mouse under the protection of the lion. The lion was old and wounded, and the English were now one of many hyenas circling around its dying body.
Oh, God, do me a favor. Oh my God, I'm getting sick of this. Hyenas around the body of the lion. Oh. It's just the activism in this. The historical standards haven't been cast aside. They've been launched out the window with a catapult. It's why do this? You know, if I saw the BBC or like Al Jazeera talking about the British Empire like this, I would understand it. You know, if you've got a dog and it shits on the floor, what do you expect? It's a dog. But Kings and Generals normally makes amazing content. You can learn so much from their videos. You can learn the intricacies of the battles, the personalities who are involved in them, the type of weapons used. It really is an amazing source on YouTube. And this is what they've lowered themselves to. It's sad. It's sad. I'll say I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed.
Body. The playing field had been leveled, and now the East India Company was poised to play the turbulent game of thrones, which would see them become the masters of Hindustan. In our next video on the history of...
My God, thank God that is over. In our next video. I'm not sure I've got the stomach for that, if it's going to be anything like this. Good Lord. Okay, conclusions. If you put to one side their childish moralising throughout, there was actually some useful information in there, particularly about the Spice Islands and the spice trade, because that's a very underappreciated part of European colonialism in Asia, is that how valuable the spices were and what they would do to get their hands on them. And it's a very interesting dynamic between the native kingdoms, the European powers, who are all competing with each other. So you've got Europeans trying to deal with the natives while sort of conquering them and negotiating with them, but then also competing against the other Europeans. And as they interestingly pointed out, that the English and the Dutch were competing with each other whilst they were allies at home against the Spanish. So you have the national political dynamic back in Europe between the governments, and then you have the competition between the companies in Asia. So two very different things going on despite them being from the same country. So that's a great part to understand. Now, I think the reason this video is such a cause for concern is because Kings and Generals have built up their credibility over time. I've seen a couple of videos that went astray, but nothing like this. They've made genuinely good content for a long time, and lots of people who come to them for an education and normally get it will be swayed by this. And this is what happens when this isn't an institution, but like in general, when institutions fall, when previously credible institutions or entities go down the activist route and abandon sort of objective principles, it causes a lot of problems. And it's really sad to see them do this, because it's a very poor way of doing history. It really is. And Western powers, Britain, America, France, whatever it is, they're condemned enough. Like, a good part of the internet and academia is dedicated to making the West look bad. And Kings and Generals were previously not a part of that. So to see them join in on the fun is just I'm not going to say a tragedy. It's not that serious, but it's horrible to see. A very special shout out goes to my Patreon supporters. Their names are on the screen right now. If you'd like to join them and support this channel, there is a link in the description below. Please like, subscribe, comment what you thought. Do you think I was too harsh on Kings and Generals? Do you think I was too nice to them? What are your thoughts on the East India Company? Let me know it all. And if you'd like me to do more videos like this, more reaction videos to other creators, please let me know that as well. Put the name of the creator, the name of the video in the comments, and I will look into it. I love making this sort of content for you, and I will see you next time.